will encourage your body to produce insulin. It will take all the blood sugar out of your blood, and then you're done for the day. And then you'll be anxious. And a lot of the rest of you too, you'll find if you're anxious, try this. It's really, really interesting experiment. The next time you're anxious, go eat something. Eat some protein and fat would be best. You could have cheese and crackers. I'm not a big fan of carbohydrates, but whatever. Eat whatever you're willing to eat, but make it solid. Don't eat a peanut butter, or don't eat a chocolate bar or something sweet. Eat something substantial, a piece of meat, a piece of cheese, some peanut butter, something like that. And then wait 10 minutes and see if you're less anxious. And try that for like 2 weeks. Every time you get anxious, eat something. Because then you can find out if your anxiousness, if your anxiety is linked to low blood sugar. And it's very likely that it is, especially if you also get irritable and foggy in your thinking. And the best way to treat that, as far as I've been able to tell, and there's a decent literature on this, is to make sure that you eat a big breakfast. And you might say, well, I'm not hungry in the morning. It's like, who the hell cares if you're hungry? I didn't say enjoy your breakfast. I said eat it. That's not the same thing. There's lots of things that you need to do that you don't enjoy to begin with. You'll get hungry in 6 months, and then you'll start to enjoy it. So that's a massive difference. I take small naps quite frequently. If I'm wiped out, I'll go have a nap for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And then that helps quite a lot. I try to wake up fairly regular, on a fairly regular schedule. That's another thing I would really recommend for people whose lives are in disarray and who are anxious. Try to fix your wake time. Going when you sleep, that's not so important. So you can still, stay up late and have fun and all that. But getting up in the morning is really helpful. So, and you also have to figure out how much you can work or write. I can't write for more than about max. My sustainable maximum for writing is 3 hours a day. And if I push it past that, then, especially if I'm editing, I make mistakes when I'm editing, so that's counterproductive, and I can't sustain it across time. And so I don't really think you can do more than about 3 hours of extremely intense intellectual work a day. Although if you have a nap, you can stretch that, but I think at least I end up paying for it across time. So nap, make sure you eat, and make sure you eat protein and fat and not carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are basically poisonous. That's about, and make sure that you get enough sleep. So that's how I combat it and try to make myself hyper efficient, which is also a really interesting thing to try. I was talking to my agents at CAA, Creative Artists Agency in LA, and I just hired a publicist too to help me manage media in a more intelligent manner. And we're trying to think about our overarching philosophy, and I first proposed to the CAA guys that our overarching philosophy would be something like, because you need an overarching philosophy under which you nest all your specific actions. It was something like to educate as many people as possible in the shortest period of time, which seems like a really good goal. Like, why the hell not do that? But then we broadened that a little bit this week, which was to try to do as much good possible as efficiently as possible. And that efficiency thing is really fun. If you guys who are listening are out for a challenge, like one of the things that you can, I think this heightens the meaning in your life, is to try to do difficult things, right? Aim high. Don't aim so damn high you can't manage it, and make sure you break down your aims into reasonably attainable sub-goals, but you want to aim high, and then you want to see how hyper efficient you can get. That's a great thing to do in your early 20s, is to see, okay, like discipline yourself. You think, okay, how much work can I do if I load myself right to the maximum? How far can I work? How hard can I work until I exhaust myself? And then you back off, obviously, because the optimal amount of working, productive engagement, let's say, is that which is sustainable across decades. So you have to learn that, but you don't learn that without stretching yourself to your limits to begin with. And, if your life isn't everything it could be, and if you're suffering from an excess of meaninglessness, well, it means you're not oriented in the world of chaos and order properly. It's like you could learn to discipline yourself. Figure out what it is that you need to do and that you want to do, and then see how efficient you can get. Because one of the things that's quite fun is to figure out, if you have a task, I always tell my graduate students this if they're doing an experiment too, if you have a task that you have to do, it's really interesting to spend a few minutes, sometimes hours, depending on how long the task is, see if you can figure out how to do it from 5 to 10 times faster. It means you'll have to rearrange the way you think about it, but you can often do it. And that's how extremely productive people get so hyper efficient, Sometimes it means you have to delegate. Sometimes it means you have to bring other people aboard. That's delegation as well, I suppose. But there's a lot of preconceptions that you hold about who you are and who the world is that you could dispense with that would make you a way more efficient actor in the world. And so, all right, so that's that. If past experiences shape us from the moment of birth, how can an action be ever said to be the result of free will rather than the accumulation of past influences? Well, it is in large part the accumulation of past influences because that's knowledge. But I addressed that, I would say, already pretty thoroughly in my discussion of free will. Your free will isn't absolute. I mean, what are you, a genie? Even a genie is constrained inside a lamp. So there's no action without constraint. There's no action without limitation. So it's just not conceptualized well. And all of your choices are constrained, not least by the fact that you have to keep yourself alive. So even just because there are limitations that emerge, say, as a consequence of the accumulation of past influences, doesn't mean that you don't still have a massive domain of freedom. So what is your opinion of attachment-based therapy, and do you think that therapy is at risk of encouraging people to wallow in self-pity? I'm not going to talk about attachment-based therapy because I don't know enough about it to provide an intelligent critique, but I can answer the second part of the question. Do I think that therapy risks encouraging people to wallow in self-pity? Not if it's done by a competent therapist. If your therapist is encouraging you to wallow in self-pity, then it's time to get the hell out of there. You've got a therapist who thinks that they're supposed to offer you a safe space. That's not helpful. Look, what do you do as a therapist? You act as a strategic counselor. So let's imagine someone comes to see me. So there's two big mysteries, right? What's wrong and what would look better? What's wrong and what would a cure look like? And I don't know. And so if you're a therapist, the first thing you want to do is figure out that you don't know what's wrong with this person, and probably neither do they, and you also don't know what's right for them. And so then you start talking to the person to try to solve that problem. It's like, okay, you've come to see me because something isn't right in your life. What is it? And so then the person has to talk and talk and talk, and you have to ask them questions to find out, because, maybe they're depressed, maybe they're anxious, maybe they came from a terrible family, maybe they're really hard on themselves and things are actually going better than they think. Like, you have no idea what's wrong with them. You're ignorant, and so are they. And so you say, look, you can tell me anything. Try to tell the truth, because otherwise we're just not going to get anywhere, because we're trying to deal with reality here. So tell me the truth. I'm not going to be judgmental in any stupid sense. I'm going to judge like mad because I want to help you do things right. So I'm going to be judging like mad, but I'm not going to throw you out because of the things you say. You're going to have to wander all over weird territory to explain your problem because you don't even know what it is. So you have to listen a lot. And the first thing you want to figure out is, okay, what's wrong here? And the person will tell you 100 things that might be wrong. And they're quite painful to listen to often. They'll tell you about their past and their present. I don't mean painful in that it's not engaging or that it's not worthwhile. I mean, people's lives have a lot of pain in them, so it's painful to partake in that. So they'll tell you like 100 things that might be wrong. And then you do an analysis with them, and you think, well, okay, how many of those things really probably aren't a problem? The first thing that happens is if you let a person talk about, let's say they tell you about 100 problems. The first thing you find out is that 90 of them aren't real problems. And the person just figures that out as they talk them through. So they say, oh, well, that's linked to this, and maybe that's not really a problem. That's not as bad as I thought it was, and we can probably ignore that. It's like they have a handful of cards that aren't organized, and they don't know what to do with them. There's too many cards. And so you say, look, lay your cards on the table, all of them. And this is also what you do when you're listening to someone you're intimate with, and they're trying to solve a problem. And you have to be patient to do this, because they're all upset about something. Right? And you don't know what it is. And maybe they're upset about you. And maybe they're upset about themselves. And they're not handling it very well. And they're impulsive and volatile and hard on you. And you say, all right, Christ, I'm going to listen to you. It's like, what's your stupid problem? And then they lay out their problem, right? The problem space. And you have to listen and not jump in there too quickly with a damn solution, because what the hell do you know? So you listen to them lay out the problem space. They lay their cards on the table. Then you say, well, we don't have to pay attention to this, and we don't have to pay attention to this, and we don't have to pay attention to this. And that's the cutting the dragon of chaos down to size. That's what it is. You look at the dragon of chaos and it starts to shrink. Okay, so, and that's because by looking at it, you indicate to the dragon that you're bigger than you thought you were and that you're bigger than it thought you were. And that's very, very useful. So anyways, you lay out your cards and then you start to organize them. It's like, well, actually, I only have 10 problems. All right, so then you think, well, how can we break those problems down into manageable sub-problems, and how can you go about addressing them? That can be very complicated. I hate my job. Well, do you have an alternative? No. Well, why not? Well, I don't have a resume. I hate being interviewed. I'm afraid to make a resume. I loused up my education. I don't have any options. It's like, yeah, that's a lot of problems, man. And that's, those are strategic problems. So then you have to figure out how to help the person strategize and then implement the strategies. And so the next step is, okay, now we know your problems. If you could have a solution, like that would be the opposite of the problem, what might a solution look like? Same issue. It's like, well, there's lots of solutions. I don't know what to do with my life. I don't know what job to have. I don't know what person to establish a long-term intimate relationship with. I don't know what I would like to do with my family. I don't know how to use my time outside of work. I don't know how to resist temptation like drug and alcohol abuse. I don't know how to take care of myself mentally and physically. All these complicated problems. It's like, okay, let's sketch out a potential solution. If you could have what you wanted, so that would be a cure, what would that look like? We formalize this, by the way, in the future authoring process. So if you do the future authoring program, which is part of the self-authoring suite, it will guide you through doing this. It's unbelievably useful to do that, because you're not going to hit what you don't aim at. So then you have the person lay out, okay, well, where are we headed? It's a map. Now we know where we are, and it's a problem. Now we have to figure out where we're headed. And then finally, once we figure out where we're headed, we have to figure out how to get there. We have to make the map. It's got a beginning place. It's got an end place. Now we have to map out the terrain. So like, well, I didn't finish my degree, or maybe I didn't go to college, or maybe I didn't finish high school. It's like, well, do you need a different job? Yes. Do you need a high school diploma to get that? Yes. What steps do you have to take to get a high school diploma? Maybe you have to start with one course, right? Okay, where do you find a course? You go look it up online. What things make you afraid to go back to school? Which of those things are stopping you? How are you going to overcome those fears? So you take the large-scale vision, which is the place you're headed to in the future, that's the cure, and then you break it down into the strategic elements that are necessary to be implemented on a day-to-day basis. And you do that so that they're difficult, but attainable. And then the person, if they're not difficult, then they're not worth attaining, obviously. Obviously, you're not pushing yourself, and you want the person not only to develop in the direction they're supposed to develop, but you want to get them better at developing. So you want to push them, just like you do with kids or yourself, if you have any sense. And so you break it down into small, implementable, daily processes, and then you review those with your client. None of that's wallowing in self-pity, man. Quite the contrary. Quite the contrary. So psychotherapy is get your story together. Who are you? Where you're going? Where are you going? What's your strategy? How are you going to learn to overcome the frightening and unexpected things that are going to pop up at you when you implement that strategy? So, and those can be, some of those things can be the natural world. I'm afraid of death. I'm afraid of illness. I'm afraid of insanity. And some of those can be the social world. I'm afraid of my boss. I'm afraid of my wife. I'm afraid of my friends. I'm afraid of being humiliated. I'm afraid that people won't like me. Those are the two big classes of fears, right? Fear of the great mother, nature, fear of the great father, culture. And if you're really afraid, you get to have both those fears at the same time. So there's nothing about that that's wallowing in self-pity. Quite the contrary. It's a bad therapist that does that. They're not there to feel sorry for you. They are there to be on the side of the part of you that's aiming up, and to encourage you and to allow you to have a space where you can lay out your thoughts using your free speech to think, where you can lay out your thoughts about what's wrong with you and how that might be set right. It's nothing to do with wallowing in self-pity. I don't want to calculate high-resolution utopia for myself only to have it squandered by fortune. How do I ensure the meaning I experience is self-determined? Well, you can't, because there's an arbitrary element to existence. So it is going to be squandered to some degree by fortune. But that's not the point. What are you going to do? Just sit back on your laurels and wait for things to roll over you? So what you do, look, the hero myth basically says, go out there, confront the dragon, get the gold, share it with the community, and live properly. Or it says, the alternative is, face the tyrant, enter the desert as a consequence because everything falls apart, recast structure, find the promised land. Those are the two elements to the hero myth. And that's divine. It's the closest thing to divine that we know. You might say, well, what happens if you follow the divine path? And the answer might be, well, everything turns out perfectly because God is on your side. It's like, no, that isn't what happens because things don't turn out perfectly. It's your best bet. It's your best strategy, right? That's the thing. And, dragons wouldn't be dragons if they couldn't eat you. And so, but that's okay. That's okay. And this is something I found so useful about the biblical stories, especially about the Abrahamic stories, which I didn't know that well till I lectured about them last year. God calls people to the adventure of their lives. And so you could say in part, God is that force within you which calls you to the adventure of your life. And it says, get away from your family, get away from your blind and unconscious comfort, and get the hell out there in the world. Well, God calls Abraham out from his fathers where he stayed far too long and from his kin where it's secure. And like the first thing he encounters is a famine, and then he encounters a tyranny inhabited by people who want to steal his wife. It's like you think, well, Abraham should have just stayed in bed and ignored God, obviously. Well, that isn't how it is. It's like we're built for struggle, us human beings. You're not after the bubbles of bliss that Dostoevsky described in Notes from Underground. We're built to contend with the world. We're built to contend with reality. You want a challenge. And the best way that you can take on a challenge, because a challenge fortifies you. So you don't want to be secure, you want to be strong. And you get strong by taking on optimal challenges. And so you lay out your destiny in the world and you take the slings and arrows of fate. And you make yourself stronger while you're doing so. And you might fail and fortune might do you in. But it's your best bet. And people have extracted unbelievable successes out of catastrophic failures. And I'm not saying that in a naive way. I know perfectly well what happens to people. You're doing fine in life and then you get cancer. And then 6 months later you're dead. And all the heroism in the world isn't going to save you at that point. But that's not the point. That's not the point. Life is bounded by mortality. But that doesn't mean that you don't get out there and contend. And you develop by contending. And you minimize the net amount of suffering in the world. And that's something, man. That's something to do. So it beats laying in your basement and getting bitter. And then doing the terrible things that bitter people do. So you can't ensure that the meaning you experience is self-determined, but you can play your role to the best of your ability, and that will be good enough. And that will be good enough. That meaning, the meaning that you will find in that, I believe, is sufficient to be sustaining, and perhaps even sustaining through the flood. So it isn't that you can avoid catastrophe, it's that you can prepare yourself to deal with it honorably when it arrives. That's what you've got. I have very high orderliness and low industriousness. 23rd. I have very high orderliness, 90th percentile, low industriousness, 23rd percentile. What can I do to remedy this and get a higher industriousness? Okay, first of all, that's not that low. Okay, we got to think about percentiles here for a minute because they're not percentages, they're different. So if you're at the 23rd percentile and there were 4 people in a room, you'd be the least industrious of 4 of them. And that kind of puts you in the average range. It's not that big a deal. There's problems with it. We'll get to that. Although maybe you're high in openness too. Anyways, I won't get into that. Low would be 5th percentile because that makes you 1 in 20, or 2nd percentile because that makes you 1 in 50. It's kind of interesting to visualize a fairly large high school class and then to think of yourself as situated in there. If you're the least industrious person out of 50, that's going to be a problem. You better be smart or have some other things going for you because you're going to have a hard time being diligent enough to be successful. Okay, having said that, and maybe 1st percentile makes you 1 in 100 and 0.1 percentile makes you 1 in 1,000. So you got to think about percentiles properly. So having said that, let's say you're not very high in industriousness. What should you do? A, make a damn plan. Okay, you need a plan for your life. And I would say use the future authoring program because that will help you make a plan. Or make a plan on your own. That's fine. Or make a plan because you talk to someone. But, we put the future authoring program together to help people develop a vision of where they could be, a counter vision to scare the hell out of them, by helping them think through how catastrophic things could become if they let all their stupidities get the upper hand. And then a second part of the program that helps you make a strategy. And we know the future authoring program helps people, young men in particular, who are doing worse, by the way, in academic situations. It increases the probability that they will stay in college and university by between 25 and 50%. So make a damn plan. And make one you want. Like, don't make a plan that is what you should do, even though it will be what you should do. Make a plan that outlines a future so that you can sit back and say, look, if I had that future, then all the horrible things that are going to happen to me are going to be worthwhile. That's what you want. So you want to think this game is worth playing despite its tragedy. That's what you've got in life. Enough meaning to serve as an antidote to tragedy. All right, now, and then you generate a strategy. And then the other thing you should do if you're not very industrious is discipline yourself. And so what do you do with that? Eat 3 times a day at regular meal times. That's a good thing to practice because that starts to put some stability into your life. Get up at the same time. I would highly recommend all those young people out there who are listening, like, you want to get a jump on life, get the hell out of bed in the morning. You know, as I've got older, I've got up earlier and earlier. Now, that's partly because you don't need as much sleep, but it's also partly because I've got more and more disciplined. Like, get up early in the morning and get your things done. Man, learn to get up at 6 in the morning and you'll be one deadly creature, especially if you can get to work. You'll have half your damn day done by the time other people haul their sorry asses out of bed. And so that's a massive, massive advantage. Look, Warren Farrell, not the comedian, Warren Farrell, the author, he outlined data in Why Men Earn More, which is a book I would recommend, by the way, showing that if you work 13% longer hours, you make 40% more money. It's nonlinear. So you think, why is that? Well, imagine you had 10 employees and one of them works an extra 10%. It's not much. Well, how often is that person going to be promoted, assuming you have a clue as a boss? It's like you're going to look at the 10 people and you're going to think, oh, that guy's always here like 45 minutes early. It's like, why don't we give him the promotion? Obviously, right? So these small edges that you can manage like that, work an extra 10%, extra 13%, have non-proportional payoffs. That's part of the Pareto distribution. So get your sleep cycle organized so you get up in the morning. Learn how to do it. No excuses. I'm too tired in the morning. I don't like mornings. Who cares? That's not relevant. It's like discipline yourself so you can manage it. Schedule your meals because that's a good disciplinary routine. And then learn to use a calendar, like Google Calendar. Many of you out there do not use a calendar. Okay, a calendar is not a prison and it's not a tyrant. Not if you use it properly. A calendar keeps anxiety at bay. It makes sure that you do what you need to do, which is important because otherwise you fall behind. But if you use it properly, it also helps you plan what you want to do. So I could say, well, lay out your damn calendar and design the days you would like to have. That's what your calendar is for. So you can put in all sorts of things in there you want to do and that would be good for you. And that's a really good way to start being more industrious. Make a plan. You need a plan for 3 years. You need a plan for the next year. You need a plan for the next 6 months. You need a plan for the next 3 months. You need a plan for the week. You need a plan for the day. You need a plan for the hour. All of that. I make lists constantly of what I have to do. And they're like daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. Right now, I can't look out more than about 6 months, because my life is too complicated and chaotic. But you need a vision of who you could be, what character you could have. 3 to 5 years out, you can't go much farther than that because life is too unpredictable, I think, to make vision that's longer term than that subject to. There's too much chance associated with it to spend a lot of time on. Maybe you can stretch it to 5 years, and in rare cases, you can have a 10-year goal, but it has to be pretty low resolution. But you want plans at all those levels of resolution. Hello. So, you've lined up a very large number of questions today. So, a couple of things. First of all, I have a number of YouTube videos and podcasts lined up. One with Steven Pinker, author of Enlightenment Now. One with Warren Farrell, who wrote a very interesting book called The Boy Crisis, and also a previous book called Why Men Earn More. One with an animator named Nina Paley. One with a young guy named Charlie Kirk, who has organized a large number of campus youth groups, more on the conservative end of things and associated with free will. So all those will be coming out in the next month and a half, I would say. And so thank you for your continued support. It makes all of this possible. And I'm also going on tour. I presume some of you know that. If you go to jordanbpeterson.com and you look up events, you can see where. It's about 40 cities listed so far. Most of them are in the US and a couple in Europe, Iceland, the UK. But we're going to announce 10 Canadian cities here in the next week as well. So that's all what's going to be happening with me in the next 2 months. So I'll be on the road with my wife that whole time, sometimes in a plane, just commercial travel, sometimes in a motorhome, depending on where we're going and how. So I'm looking forward to seeing you if you come out to the events. I've been enjoying them quite a bit. It's good to be able to talk to so many people. So 12 Rules for Life has sold about 1 million copies now. So that's really quite something. And I think we've sold foreign rights in 43 countries. So it'll come out in not quite that many languages, but just about over the next year and a half, something like that. So, all right, so let's get at it here. Hopefully I can warm up and get my brain going and answer some questions. The first one, 343 people have voted this one up. Could you please discuss free will and Sam Harris's and others' ideas of its non-existence? Well, that's a good, complicated question to kick things off. So I want to tell you a little bit about how to conceptualize free will, I think, first, because it's obvious that we don't have infinite free will. Our choices are constrained in all sorts of ways. And I think part of the reason that there's a continual discussion about free will in the philosophical literature is because just conceptualizing the issue properly is extraordinarily difficult. So I like to think about it, at least in part, the way that you think about a game. If you're playing a game, obviously the game has rules. So if it's a chess game or a basketball game, then there are things that you can do and things that you can't do. And so it's a closed world in some sense. But the fact that there are things you can't do when you play a game also seem to open up a universe of possibilities for things that you can do. So chess obviously constrains you to a board and to a certain number of men and to a certain pattern of rules. But the strange thing is that when you put in those rules, because rules sound like limits, they sound always like things you can't do. But when you set up a constrained world like that and you lay out a system of rules, what you do is open up a near infinity of possibilities. Same with music. Music has rules, obviously. And if you follow the rules, then you can make an infinite variety of music. And so there's a very interesting dynamic that's hard to understand between constraint and possibility. And there's a deep idea that's associated with that I read in some Jewish commentary on the biblical stories that I read a long time ago, talking about the relationship between God and man. And the idea was that God, imagine a being with the classical attributes of God, omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence, all-seeing, all-knowing, and all-powerful. What does a being like that lack? And obviously the answer is nothing, right? Because by definition, those three traits provide for absence of limitation. But then that's exactly what's lacking, is limitation. And there's some strange connection between limitation and I was saying, limitation that's rule governed, as I mentioned before, and the opening up of possibility. So it isn't necessarily the case that now determinism and limitation aren't exactly the same thing, but they're analogous and they need to be discussed together. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that whatever our free choice is, it isn't limited. It's limited. It's deeply limited. Now, here's another thing. If I take my arm and I go like this, you see, I'll do that again. Now, you see there's a movement like that, and then my hands stop just before my other hand. Now, it takes a certain amount of time for the neural messages to go from my brain to my arm and back. And the time it takes my hand to go like this and stop is actually shorter than the time it takes a message to get to my brain and back. So what that means is that when I plan this movement, which is called a ballistic movement, it's called a ballistic movement because it's like a bullet. Once you let it go, it's gone. There's no calling it back. I've actually organized the neurological and muscular sequences that enable that action before it's implemented. I set all that up, and then it's released, and the whole thing cascades. And so once the action has been released, let's say, then I don't really have any free will because I can't stop it. Now, so you think about that. It looks like there's a temporal gradient with regards to free will, is that as you look out into the future, perhaps the farther out you look into the future, the farther down the road, let's say, the more free your choices are. But the closer they get to implementation, the more they become deterministic, governed by standard causal processes. And there's some transition point where they change from being what we would describe as choice, that we haven't got to free choice yet, but at least to choice. There's some transition point between that and ballistic movement. Here's another way of thinking about it. Like we know, for example, that people who are expert at playing the piano look ahead of where they're playing. And they're doing the same thing. They're watching the notes. They're seeing where they're going. And then they're disinhibiting the automated structures that enable them to play what they've practiced so thoroughly. They're disinhibiting those structures. And then they go automatically. And then what happens if you make a mistake is that consciousness notes the error and then unpacks the motor sequences that have been practiced. And then you re-practice them and sequence them again until they become automatic and deterministic. So there's choice in that you're reading ahead, but there's no choice in that once you've read ahead and disinhibited the actions, then they run ballistically. And then you can think about the same thing that's happening when you're driving in a car. You don't look right in front of you when you're driving a car, because whatever is right in front of you, if you're going 40 miles an hour or whatever, you've already run over. You look a quarter of a mile down the road, and that gives you the opportunity to see what's coming and to set up a sequence of increasingly automated movements that culminate in whatever it is that you're doing while you're driving. And so there's a gradation from choice to determinism, a temporal gradation. And I don't often see that addressed when people talk about free will. Now, Sam's issue with free will is that if you get someone to do something like lift their finger, and you scan their brains using a variety of techniques while they're doing that, what you'll see is that there's an action potential that and you ask them to voluntarily move their finger, so they're doing it, let's say, by free choice. There's an action potential that you can read off the brain that occurs before the person either moves their finger or, let's say, decides to move their finger, and that occurs quite a bit before the feeling of voluntarism or that voluntary act. And so that's been read by Benjamin Libet, who did the experiments, as indication that even the feeling of voluntary choice is determined. But I don't think that that's a very useful way of addressing the issue, because the issue of when you lift your finger up again is it requires pre-programming to disinhibit. Like, you know how to do this, right? You don't have to learn to do that. So you have a little automated circuit that does this sort of thing. All these finger movements and everything, you can see babies practicing them. And they develop automated circuitry that tends to be posterior left hemisphere in order to run those automated processes out. And what you're basically doing when you decide to do something that's a routine that you've already practiced, or made out of subroutines that you've already practiced, is disinhibiting them. And the degree to which you might regard that as free exactly is unclear, as are the temporal limitations. So I don't think that Libet's experiments demonstrate conclusively that there's no such thing as free will, even though there are action potentials that indicate that there is brain activity signaling even the onset of a voluntary choice early. Now, another thing that we might look at in relationship to that is, so we could look at it phenomenologically, and we could also look at it in relationship to how people treat one another. So phenomenologically, it seems clear that we have free choice, and it isn't obvious to me why we have consciousness if free choice isn't real, because consciousness looks to me like a mechanism that deals with potential before it's transformed into actuality, let's say. And I think consciousness is also the faculty, so to speak, or a manifestation of the faculty that enables us to pre-program deterministic actions. So again, let's think about someone playing the piano. They're practicing. After you repeat and you repeat your finger movements, if you're playing the piano, any complex motor skill is like that. You have to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And you're using consciousness to program it, to sequence the motor movements and to pay attention to them. That all seems voluntary, and it involves the activation of a tremendous amount of your brain, because if you're doing something new, a lot of your brain is activated. And then as you practice it, the amount of brain that's activated decreases. It shifts from right to left, and then it shifts from frontal to posterior, and a smaller and smaller area. So what's happening is that consciousness is creating little machines in the back of your head that do things in an automated manner. And the consciousness looks like consciousness appears and feels, that would be the phenomenological end, as if it's doing that voluntarily, and it is associated with a different pattern of brain activity. And so, okay, so there's that. There's the phenomenological reality of voluntary choice and effort as well, because conscious programming of that sort is also effortful. It doesn't seem to run deterministically like a clock does. And then finally, there's also, and I don't know what you think about this with regards to evidence, but what constitutes evidence is not always that easy to determine, even in the scientific domain. So think about how we think about ourselves and other people, and how we treat ourselves and other people. You can imagine that you're like a clock running down, and that's like a deterministic model. But people aren't clocks. We're dissipative structures. A clock is something that runs downhill. But human beings, you can look up dissipative structure. I think that was an idea that was first formulated by the physicist Schrödinger. We're not clocks by any stretch of the imagination, and we take energy in and we disperse energy, and we're anti-entropic in a temporary sense. So that makes us, and life is as well. Schrödinger wrote about that in a book called What is Life? And what we seem to do, this is how it looks to me. We don't contend with the present, and we're not driven by the past. Instead, what we see in front of us is a landscape of possibility. And in my wilder moments, I think that's associated with the physical idea of multiple universes. But that's in my wilder moments. It's just a speculation. And so what we see in front of us is an array of potential universes. And those are the universes that we could bring about as a consequence of our actions. And we make choices to the right or the left. There's a lot of mythological speculation about that sort of idea too, in an ethical sense, because we decide what sort of reality that we want to bring into being. And so we encounter potential like God did at the beginning of time when he made order out of chaos. Chaos is this chaotic potential. We confront chaotic potential with our consciousness, and we cast that into reality. And that, now then you think, well, is that really the case? Well, that's hard to say, because there are limits to our knowledge about consciousness and about reality. But if you treat yourself like you're a free moral agent with choice, and that you can determine the course of your life, then you seem to get along better with yourself and to be less anxious and to be more productive. And if you treat other people like that they're free agents that are making voluntary choices about how reality is going to come into being, and you reward them when they do it properly, and you punish them or otherwise discipline them when they don't, when they do it badly, then your relationships with them seem to work. And then if we predicate our society on the presupposition that each individual human being is capable of doing just that, then we seem to have extremely functional societies. And so, and this is something that Sam Harris has been taken to task for many times, is if you dispense with the idea of free will, how is it you organize your relationship to yourself, your interactions with your family, and your relationships with the broader social community? It's a very complicated issue. So I believe strongly that we have free will, that we're responsible for our choices. Those choices are constrained in many, many ways. I think there's a gradient of free will from free out into the future to increasingly constrained as the present manifests itself, to deterministic in the moment. When in the moment of action, we might think that we enter the realm of deterministic causality at the moment of action, something like that. That's how it looks to me. So at this rate, we're going to answer about 5 questions. But that was a very, very hard one. So anyways, I hope that's helpful. Maelstrom, who is apparently chaos, given the name, asks me, am I chaos or am I order? Well, that's a good question. I would say a lot of the time I'm chaos, but I do everything I can to put things in order. But I'm going to answer that in a deeper way, I would say, because first of all, everything and everyone is chaos and order at the same time. And I don't mean that in a trite sense. I mean it in a technical sense, which is order, technically speaking, in my way of viewing the world, is order is that domain you inhabit when what you're doing produces the results that you want to have happen. That's a pragmatic perspective from a philosophical perspective. It's derived, at least in part, or is analogous to the pragmatism of people like C.S. Peirce and William James, the early American pragmatists. And there's a great book on all that, if you're interested, called The Metaphysical Club. So order is where you are when what you're doing is producing the results that you intended. And that validates what you're doing, by the way. That's a pragmatic form of truth. Your theory is accurate when, if you enact it, then the results that you intend emerge. That's the definition of truth from a pragmatic perspective. It's a very powerful definition, and it's very much associated with the Darwinian notion of truth. So that's worth looking into. Now, obviously, there are times when you implement a plan and a world conception that goes along with that plan, and what you wanted didn't happen. And so then the domain of chaos comes up, the domain of the unpredictable and unexpected, and you have to contend with it. And sometimes when you are acting, you do perverse things and things that surprise you, and then things don't work out well for you, or maybe you get a surprise, and maybe sometimes that might even be positive. And that's because the chaos within you has manifested itself, and you've done something that exceeds the bounds of your understanding. And, that can happen to people so badly that they develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes soldiers, especially naive young soldiers, will go on a battlefield and watch themselves do something they can't imagine they're capable of doing, and then they have permanent post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's a chaos within that can manifest itself, that can disrupt whatever order you are. And you know that in minor ways, because everybody's always running around doing things that aren't good for them, that they know they shouldn't do, and that they can't control. And so there's a chaotic and an orderly aspect to everything, to the individual, to the family, to the social world, to the natural world. It's chaos and order at every level of analysis simultaneously, which is why the Taoists think of the world as made out of yin and yang, which is essentially analogous to the idea of order and chaos. And now, but then there's another element too. So your order and your chaos. And the place that you live, the environment, is order and chaos as well. But you're also the process that mediates between the two. And what that means is you're the force that confronts chaos and casts it into order. We talked about that in the free will discussion. That's the basis for the dragon myth, or at least part of it, the hero myth. You're the force that confronts chaos and transforms it into habitable order. And there's an idea that if you do that using truthful speech, it's probably the deepest idea in the Bible. If you confront chaos and the unknown using truthful speech, then the order that you produce is good. So that also means that your chaos and order and the process that intermediates between them. And that's really the basis of the hero myth. So part of that is the hero story and the dragon myth. Go out, confront the dragon, get the gold, bring it back, share it with the community. And the dragon is a representation of that which dwells beyond the confines of the safe and habitable space, right? It's an image of a predator. That's part of what it is, although it's way more complicated than that. And you're also the force that confronts order when it becomes too tyrannical and restructures it back to chaos, and then restructures the chaos back into more beneficial order, which is what you do, for example, if you have an argument with someone that you settle, right? Because the argument takes the orderly relation that you have with that person and then produces a chaotic interlude, which is all the pain that's associated with the argument. And that's a dissolution into what Mircea Eliade called pre-cosmogonic chaos. And out of that, a new order can emerge. And so the best way to construe yourself is not as chaos or as order, but as the process that mediates between them. And that's the basis for the ethos of the West, is that the human being is best represented as the individual, and the individual is that attentive and communicative entity that is continually capable of mediating properly between chaos and order. Now, this is a deep idea. You could read Maps of Meaning if you would like. The audio version of that is coming out June 12th, by the way. And I will make a video detailing the relationship between Maps of Meaning and 12 Rules of Life. But you can construe yourself, you should construe yourself as the process that mediates between chaos and order. And you should aim to be the process that does that properly, using truthful communication, because that's how you keep the elements of existence properly balanced. And you might say, yeah, but is that real? Well, if you read Maps of Meaning, there's a section on neuropsychology that's also buttressed by a book written by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary that lays out the relationship between the right and left hemisphere. Now, it's quite strange that we have a right and left hemisphere. It's almost as if we have two consciousnesses dwelling in our being. And they're quite separable. If you cut the corpus callosum that unites the two, then the two hemispheres will act independently to some degree. You can communicate with each of them somewhat independently. So they actually view the world quite differently. And that hemispheric distinction is not only there in human beings, but also in animals, a long way down the phylogenetic chain. Now, I made the claim partly because I was reading a man named Elkonin Goldberg, who was a student of Alexander Luria, the most brilliant neuropsychologist of the 20th century. And Goldberg made the case that the left hemisphere is specialized for what's known, and the right hemisphere is specialized for anomaly. And V.S. Ramachandran, who's a famous neurologist, an MD in California, has also made a very similar claim based on his analysis of brain-damaged individuals. But Goldberg's case was the left hemisphere is specialized for what you know how to do, and the right hemisphere is specialized for response to what's unknown. And that maps onto this order-chaos dimension, right? And the right hemisphere, now, McGilchrist, in his book, The Master and His Emissary, has pointed out quite clearly that the left hemisphere has a tyrannical tendency, which Ramachandran also viewed in his brain-damaged patients, by the way, and that the left hemisphere is always trying to impose its logical and restricted order on the world and to make the world fit into that. Now, it has to do that. There's reasons for that. Part of the reason is that if your theory you've worked on for 10 years makes one prediction error, you shouldn't throw the whole damn thing out. You should doubt the prediction error, right? Because you never know when your data is actually data or is just another kind of theory. We can't get into that at the moment. Now, McGilchrist makes a very strong case, and I think a more elaborated case than I made in Maps of Meaning, but it's the same argument fundamentally, that the right hemisphere is concerned with reaction to anomaly. And so what happens in some sense is something unexpected happens. That's the domain of chaos. And that stops you in your tracks. It freezes you, and that's a predator response, a prey response, actually. You're frozen. The unknown has manifested itself. You're not in order anymore. You don't know where you are, and you don't know what to do. And you can't just shut down like a computer does. You freeze instead. And then what happens is that the ancient mechanisms that have helped our ancestors for tens of millions of years, or perhaps longer than that, react to that which lurks beyond the confines of the unknown, kick in, and you start, first of all, that's motoric, so you freeze, and then you cautiously start to explore, and then it's imagistic. You start making imaginal representations, metaphoric representations, dramatic representations of what might constitute the unknown. And then those representations are practiced and implemented in the world, and they become more and more fine-grained and automatized. And as that happens, the locale that they're represented in the brain shifts from right to left. So the reason I'm telling you all this is because, this is where the metaphysical and the physical unite. And this is the sort of argument that I was trying to make to Sam Harris. And hopefully we'll be able to continue doing that because I'm going to meet him 3 times in the next few months. So that The yin-yang idea, the chaos-order idea, is metaphorical in some sense. To say that the world is made up of order and chaos doesn't sound like an empirical statement. But strangely enough, the world to which our brains are adapted is actually the world of chaos and order. You can think about it as unexplored and explored territory too. That's another take on it. And so then you think from a Darwinian perspective. Think about it this way. From a Darwinian perspective, there's an axiomatic presupposition, and that is reality is that which selects. Okay? Reality is the force that selects over evolutionary time. And so the force that selects over evolutionary time has selected for hemispheric specialization, bilateral hemispheric specialization, which indicates that two different modes of looking at the world are necessary for survival, right? So that's real. And so the idea that the world is made out of chaos and order is perhaps the most real idea. Now, here's something else cool that's associated with that. And this is an antidote to nihilism. I also think it's an antidote to what would you call ideological possession. So when you encounter something unknown, you orient towards it, and that's an involuntary response. You could even think about it as a deterministic response. It's part of what orients you very rapidly towards predators so that they don't kill you before you have a chance to respond. Okay, so you react because the anomalous thing is meaningful. It's intrinsically meaningful. And the reaction is first terror with perhaps an overlay of disgust, and second curiosity. And it's terror so that you freeze and remain paralyzed. You turn to stone when you look at the basilisk or the snake or the gorgon. You turn to stone. You're paralyzed like a prey animal. And that's so the predator can't see you, at least in part. And there's other elements of the orienting reflex that are associated with predator avoidance. And then if nothing additionally terrible happens, you start to thaw out and you start to explore, and you do that with image first, and then practice the appropriate behaviors, and then automate those. Now, look, here's the thing that's cool. So that orienting reflex to the unknown it's an admixture of threat, fear, and curiosity, incentive, reward. So negative emotion and positive emotion. Now, and it's dose dependent. The larger the anomaly, which means the larger the map it blows out when it manifests itself. Think of the difference between being irritated at your marital partner because they, who knows, because they were late to pick you up for work, compared to how irritated you would be if you found out they were having an affair. Difference in size of anomaly. The first one disrupts a tiny little part of your space-time orientation, and the second one demolishes your past, present, and future. And the larger the disruption, the more negative emotion, obviously. And so there's this weird interplay between negative and positive emotion in the response to anomaly. But it's deeply meaningful, even if it paralyzes you, even if it's terrifying, it's meaningful. And then that transforms perhaps into intense curiosity, and you start to explore. Now, the phenomena of meaning is a manifestation of the complex orienting reflex. And so you're wired so that you're not just order and you're not just chaos. You're order, continually confronting chaos so that the order remains updated. And you might say, well, how do you know how much chaos you should confront in order to keep the order continually updated? And the answer is meaning. See, something is meaningful. The reason that something is meaningful is because you're getting a deep instinctual signal that you're encountering anomaly at a rate that doesn't exceed your capability. That's also the rate at which you can keep yourself updated optimally. And so meaning isn't epiphenomenal, and it isn't some kind of delusion that rationality can and should overcome to say, well, everything's meaningless. It's like, no, it's not. Meaning is the most fundamental instinct for adaptation. And so that's partly why in 12 Rules for Life, I said one of the rules, I think it's Rule 7, is do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Because meaning is a really good guide to long-term adaptation. And so then, and the other thing about meaning, which is what happens when you get the balance between chaos and order right, is that meaning is the antidote to despair. And so and there's all sorts of reasons in life to be desperate. And so if you immerse yourself in meaning, you can learn to do that. You can learn to do that. You can make that goal your highest goal. And so then the highest goal would be to be the sort of mythological hero, let's say, to embody and incarnate and imitate the mythological hero, like the imitation of Christ, which is what you're called to do if you happen to be Christian. That means that you live in meaning, and that meaning is the antidote to the suffering of life that would otherwise make you brutal and vengeful and unhappy and miserable, and like that young guy who just mowed down 12 people in Toronto. These are real things. You lose your sense of meaning. You end up in hell. And in hell you do all sorts of terrible things. These are dreadful realities. And it isn't as if they're not grounded in the appropriate science. So, anyways, that was also a very complicated question. Being gay and in a long-term relationship, we are considering kids. What are your thoughts about gay people raising children? I think the devil's in the details, to tell you the truth. If I was ever talking to any individuals about that, the question is, well, how would you raise them? I mean, you have problems, right? If you're both of the same sex, then you're going to have the problem of how to provide the proper model for, let's say you have a boy and a girl. We know this is indisputable, and this is something I've talked to Warren Farrell about. Kids in intact heterosexual families where the father is present do way better on multiple indices than kids who are part of single-parent families. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no single parents who do a good job, right? That's not the same bloody claim. Those are different claims. But on average, not only do kids where fathers are present do better, but societies, or even local societies where there are more fathers present, do better, not only for the kids that they're fathering, but the kids in the neighborhood where there are lots of intact families with fathers do better. And so I believe quite firmly that the nuclear family is the smallest viable human unit. Father, mother, child. Smallest viable unit. And if you fragment it below that, then you end up paying. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't ways that you can operate in a smaller unit or a different unit effectively. But you have to contend with the fact that it's necessary for kids to have models for both sexes. And that means accepting that the sexes are different, even though there's a fair overlap between them, accepting that they're different and that both sexes play their role. It looks like what fathers do, and I talked to Warren Farrell a lot about this, and I'm going to release this video this month about what fathers do. And a lot of what they do is rough and tumble play with the kids, which kids really, really, really like. And it's really important, as Jaak Panksepp, a great affective neuroscientist, laid out in his studies on rats. He discovered the play circuitry. And fathers, this is something Farrell told me, which was extraordinarily interesting, is that fathers use the joy of the possibility of play as a scaffold to help children learn to delay gratification. So imagine a father spends a bunch of time playing with his kids, and they're having a great old time. They're wrestling around and pushing each other's limits to find out where they are, and learning the physiological dance that goes along with direct contact, direct exciting contact, learning what hurts and what doesn't, and what constitutes fair play and what isn't, and how everybody can play and still enjoy the game, and how excited you could get before it's too much, and how much you should whine and how much you shouldn't, and when you can object to being hurt. All of that at a deeply embodied level. The kids love that. They'll line up for that. And Panksepp demonstrated very clearly that rats will work to play, and that rats play fair, and they learn to play fair because of iterated play bouts, and that if you don't let juvenile male rats play, then their prefrontal cortexes don't develop, and they get attention deficit disorder, or the equivalent in rats. And then you can treat that with Ritalin. And so this is all very vital material. Now, if you're going to, if you're gay, let's say there's two men or two women, then you have the problem of what you're going to do for the contra-sexual target. And you can say, well, it doesn't matter because there's no differences between men and women. And you can gerrymander the damn question that way and avoid your moral responsibility. Or you can face it squarely and say, look, you've decided to step outside of the cultural norm and to organize a non-standard relationship, which puts a tremendous responsibility on you. And then you have to figure out how you can provide for your children what it is that they would get in the classic minimal human unit. So, and more power to you. I hope you can do a good job of it. You know, I think there's room in the world for a diverse range of approaches to complex life problems like having kids and finding a partner. But that doesn't mean you get to bury your head in the sand about the absolute realities of life and the fact that there are biological differences between men and women. To deny that is reprehensible in my estimation. And besides, the empirical data, the scientific data are crystal clear. Okay. Carl Jung says that everything unconscious is projected into reality. How do you know if you're perceiving reality accurately or are just projecting? Great. Yeah, well, that's partly why I'm a pragmatist. Well, there's a bunch of ways. There's a bunch of ways that you know. Pain tells you. If you make a mistake and you hurt yourself, well, then your stupid theory was wrong, right? That's what the pain says. Your stupid theory was wrong. And that's a pragmatic. You see, that's another indication of pragmatic theory of truth. You lay out, look, when you look at the world, you look at the world with a set of presuppositions. I outlined that in chapter 10 in 12 Rules for Life, called Be Precise in Your Speech. It indicates that when you look at the world, you look at it through a value structure. You can't help that because you're always aiming at something in the world, and you're always aiming at something you want, and you're trying to get it. And so that means that you look at the world through a value structure. Now the question is whether or not that value structure is valid. And that's a very complicated question. Okay, so how do you know if it's valid? Number one, you lay it out and you act it out. You implement it perceptually and then you act it out. And if you get what you wanted, what the theory predicted, that's another way of thinking about it, but wanted is a better way of thinking about it, then the fact that that behavioral routine and perceptual structure produced the intended result validates it as a tool for obtaining that result, and that's a form of truth. Now, it might be the only form of truth, although I'm not convinced of that completely, but it might be. It's a very complicated question. Now, how do you know if your stupid theory is wrong? Okay, A, it fails and you're hurt. Pain tells you pragmatically, your theory was wrong. So that's why you should pay attention to your own pain, because your suffering is indication that you still have things to learn. And maybe the suffering of other people is also that. Maybe something unexpected or unpredictable happens when you're laying out your plan. And then the anomalous manifests itself, the unexpected or chaos, and then you get anxious. Well, anxiety is an indication that your plan, your arrow didn't fly to its mark, so you aimed wrong. And that might mean a small error, maybe a tiny adjustment of your bow, or it might mean you just don't know what the hell you're doing at all and everything is lost. And so anxiety tells you if your theory is wrong. And then other people tell you that, and that's why you want to surround yourself with other people, because you distribute your cognitive resource. You distribute your problems to the cognitive resources of the social group. That's what we do when we price things, right? Everyone votes on the price of something because it's so difficult, because the price of something has to be established in relationship to the price of everything else, and that's always in flux, and so it's computationally impossible problem, and so we outsource it to the market, which is the free cognitive decision of millions of people, and that's how we determine price. And so one of the things you do to make sure that you're not any stupider than you have to be, blind, ignorant, biased, and all of that, is you surround yourself with other people and you try to treat them well enough so that they can tolerate you. And then every time that you do something stupid because one of your theories is vague or incomplete or wrong or biased, or you're willfully blind, then they slap you on the side of the head. They ignore you because you're boring. They don't laugh at your jokes because they're stupid. They are irritated at your actions because you're not taking your own long-term interests or the interests of other people into account. And so you have pain, you have anxiety, you have the reward of success, that's a positive indicator that your theory is okay, and then you have the reactions of everyone else. And if you're clued in, you pay attention to all of those things, and you try to update your order, which is your perceptions. You try to update your order constantly as a consequence of being humble in the face of your errors, which is why humility is the precondition for learning and why it's one of the highest moral virtues. So, and perceiving reality accurately. You don't really perceive reality, and you don't really perceive accurately. You perceive small portions of reality, extraordinarily limited in space and time, and accurately means well enough so that when you do what you're doing, it works. That's why I'm a pragmatist. Not only. There's lots of other philosophical streams that have influenced my thought, existentialism, phenomenology, to mention two others. But the thing is, you can't perceive reality accurately because you don't know everything. So, and you're full of biases, and you're ignorant as hell. And so the best you can do is perceive small bits of reality well enough so that you can more or less get what you need in a relatively short period of time without screwing yourself up too badly in the medium to long term. That's pretty much what you've got. And that doesn't mean truth is impossible. It just means that it's very, very complicated to decide what truth is. And because the question is, what is truth for someone whose knowledge is limited? Right? Because obviously, because your knowledge is limited and you don't know everything, so in some fundamental way, you're ignorant or wrong about everything. But that doesn't help because you still have to act in the world. So there are bounded truths. There are bounded truths. And so, all right. If past experiences shape us... Oh, no, I missed one. You cite a tired brain, foggy thinking, as the reason to stop answering questions or giving a talk. How do you combat this while working or writing daily? Well, I eat a big breakfast relatively soon on waking. That really helps. If any of you out there are anxious, and many of you no doubt are, there'll be a large number of you who are anxious and don't eat breakfast. And there'll be a whole bunch of you out there who think, well, I don't eat breakfast. It isn't necessary. It's like, that's wrong. It's necessary. You fasted all night. If you load yourself cognitively or physiologically in the morning, your brain, stressed, will encourage your body to produce insulin. It will take all the blood sugar out of your blood, and then you're done for the day. And then you'll be anxious. And a lot of the rest of you, too, you'll find if you're anxious, try this. It's really, really interesting experiment. The next time you're anxious, go eat something. Eat some protein and fat would be best. You could have cheese and crackers. I'm not a big fan of carbohydrates, but whatever. Eat whatever you're willing to eat, but make it solid. Don't eat a peanut butter, or don't eat a chocolate bar or something sweet. Eat something substantial, a piece of meat, a piece of cheese, some peanut butter, something like that. And then wait 10 minutes and see if you're less anxious. And try that for like 2 weeks. Every time you get anxious, eat something. Because then you can find out if your anxiousness, if your anxiety is linked to low blood sugar. And it's very likely that it is, especially if you also get irritable and foggy in your thinking. And the best way to treat that, as far as I've been able to tell, and there's a decent literature on this, is to make sure that you eat a big breakfast. And you might say, well, I'm not hungry in the morning. It's like, who the hell cares if you're hungry? I didn't say enjoy your breakfast. I said eat it. That's not the same thing. You know, there's lots of things that you need to do that you don't enjoy to begin with. You'll get hungry in 6 months and then you'll start to enjoy it. So that's a massive difference. I take small naps quite frequently. If I'm wiped out, you know, I'll go have a nap for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And then that helps quite a lot. I try to wake up fairly regular, on a fairly regular schedule. That's another thing I would really recommend for people whose lives are in disarray and who are anxious. Try to fix your wake time. Going when you sleep, that's not so important. So you can still, you know, stay up late and have fun and all that. But getting up in the morning is really helpful. So, you know, and you also have to figure out how much you can work or write. I can't write for more than about max. My sustainable maximum for writing is 3 hours a day. And if I push it past that, then, especially if I'm editing, I make mistakes when I'm editing, so that's counterproductive, and I can't sustain it across time. And so